I think this is working. Apologies for being ever so slightly late. Turns out I'm not as good as with technology as I thought I was. So if you're watching this live, welcome, hello, thanks for tuning in wherever you are. And if you're not, then welcome anyway, and let's hope we have a nice, chill, productive session about choosing and selling your extension. I think the way I've always thought about extensions in BPs is based on a fairly common anecdote that I've read about a couple of times. If you use Quora, you'll probably see it too. And the anecdote goes something like this. So let's say you are in an interview. Someone gives you a pen and asks you to sell it, just without any information at all. Just sell me this pen. Most of the wrong answers are those which focus on something about the pen. So it's a blue pen. Hey, do you need a blue pen? Or look at it, it's got a good clip. It's going to clip to your shirt. And I think what people are impressed by, or what HR is impressed by, supposedly, is to be able to ask, what do you need as a buyer? What do you look for in a pen? What's wrong with your current pen? What's wrong with the stationery you have? And based on what they tell you, to be able to sell them the product because it meets one of their needs. And I've always thought extensions are kind of the same thing because, you know, I think whether consciously or not, by virtue of coming up in back half, judges are a lot more skeptical of what it is you are selling them. So you listen to a top half team and you're like, yeah, okay, these arguments seem fine, they seem quite good. You give them credit for that. When you are listening, in most cases, to a back half team, you are, at least if the top half has done its job, you're on some level skeptical about what it is they're going to offer you. You're on some level skeptical about their case, whether it's going to be as impactful, as well explained, especially if the obvious arguments, the ones you might have thought of within the first 2 or 3 minutes, if those arguments are off the table. So the way then to be good at selling your extension is not to pick an extension you really want to run, something about sports, something about like a Marxist extension. You can do that if you want for fun. But if you're trying to win the debate, you got to do something different. I think what you should be doing, or the way you should be thinking about it, is to think about what the judge is looking for, or what the judge is keen on buying, right? What the judge's state of mind is at that time. And I think this is true of all debating, but it is particularly true in one of the most subjective areas in BP debating, right? Because it's a bit more straightforward to say, well, opening up beat opening government because they responded to these arguments, or vice versa. But whenever you're comparing extensions against other material, then implicitly, you're leaving it in the hands of the judges, right? Because the judges is essentially choosing whether or not to buy a product you're selling, or a different product that the top half is selling. And you've got no direct way of saying, that product is terrible because of the rules of BPs. So what does it mean to think like a judge? I think what you should think about is, if you've got experience in this, then try and recall those experiences. When you're in a judging panel, either as a chair or as a wing, when comparing in a bench, what are the kinds of questions that judges ask during that 15 minutes of deliberation, right? And again, it's 15 minutes to discuss 3-4 comparisons in a round. So you're only really going to get about 2 or 3 minutes worth of comparison between you and your opening team. What does the judge want from you to give you the win? What does the judge want from you to want to give you the win? I think that's a slightly different question, because I think very often, let's be honest, judges will be meticulous as far as they can, but what you really want them to do is be in that state of mind right as they're entering the adjudication to think, to feel on gut that you're already ahead. Other questions the judge is asking during this deliberation are things like, what are the problems with the opening halves case? And so I guess before we even get into a detailed discussion about what it is to pick and sell an extension, I just want to make the first point that you are selling it to someone, and that someone is going to do a very specific thing with your extension. What they are going to do is, with what you give them, they're going to try and convince a chair or a wing, or even themselves, that you have won that debate. And so it's always very helpful to work backwards and think, what are the kinds of doubts that a panel would have about my extension? Is the doubt going to be one of newness? Is the doubt going to be one of whether I've explained this new argument well? Is the doubt going to be one of impacting? Is the doubt simply that I've left things unclear or I've not been explicit? And once you know what it is or who it is you are selling this argument to, and the types of things they are looking for in whatever circuit you're from. So I do accept that this is one of those things which might be different across circuits. So in different circuits, judges could be skeptical to different degrees or about different types of assumptions. But whatever it is, if you think about it in this way, you'll have a very good starting point as to what this whole endeavor is about. So bearing that in mind, I guess the first piece of advice I'd have is to judge a lot more, because if you judge loads of things, you'll especially judge good teams in closing behind equally good teams in an ideal case, with good judges and competent chairs, competent wings. You'll be able to think a lot more about the kind of skepticism you need to overcome, right? How you sell an argument to a reluctant buyer, as it were. So what we're going to do in this session is quite straightforward. I'm going to talk through what I think the 3 broad types of extensions are. For each one, I'm going to list some of my thoughts about what are the difficulties involved in selling this particular type of extension, or in terms of making it stick. That might be another phrase you're comfortable, you might have heard. So once we go through those 3 things, we will then summarize with, I guess, just a series of thoughts that upon reflection might be helpful going forward in terms of practicing, but also in terms of getting ready for Euros, if that's what you're working on, that apply more generally to all of these arguments. So I think there are broadly 3 types of extensions. And even then, the split between them isn't super clear. So sometimes there'll be mishmashes of both. That isn't really relevant right now. I think what's relevant is to think about what are the unique challenges that come with selling some of these arguments. And so you can think about, if you've got an extension you're running, you can think about which one of these questions is more relevant. So as a starting point, the first one I want to do is the classic analysis extension. So what is an analysis extension? Most people seem to think it's something which doesn't immediately jump out as being new, but adds newness in terms of some other quality. So you can think of them as running along the same track, perhaps running toward the same types of outcomes, but you'd be adding something significant, but not immediately obvious, right? So, and it's one of those things where some judges are, in my opinion, a lot more receptive towards this, and some judges aren't. And you kind of need to know how willing they are to credit this material. And if you've got past feedback from them, then you might want to change the way you run these arguments. But anyway, an analysis extension, it's tricky, obviously, because you might think you're adding something, but because it's not as obvious, it's not as flashy, and it's not as new, it's easy for judges to either convince themselves or convince other people that what was new wasn't either that significant or wasn't that new at all. And of course, I think the flip side of this is the so-called EPL extension, where sometimes teams say very similar things, but it feels as though by saying it in a prettier way or a slightly better way, that they get credit for those arguments. So I think that's why analysis extensions are controversial, right? Because obviously there are instances where they are valid, but there are also some cases where you don't want to get caught in the trap of either buying an analysis extension if it turns out to be illegitimate, if you're a judge, but also it's a tricky kind of argument to make, right? It's a very fine line between newness and repetitiveness. So I think the first thing to be aware of when you are pitching an analysis extension is to be upfront with the judge that the material is going to be similar. In fact, in your head, it's ideal if you could even know what the similarity is. So for example, we are going to share impacts in the sphere of economics, but what we are going to do differently is a mechanism. Now, sometimes it's a little bit of difference in all of these areas, in which case you don't have to commit to what your newness is going to be. But I think it's often very helpful to be upfront and just say, panel or judge or chair, whatever you prefer. The material is going to be similar. We are just going to flag out for you where it will be new and superior. I think the reason why it's unwise to try and exaggerate or pretend otherwise is that a judge who's reasonably discerning, once they realize you're being disingenuous or once they think that's what you're doing, then they're just a lot more skeptical of everything else you're saying, right? So I think the key here, and I think it's tricky because teams in this position sometimes feel like they have to overcompensate because their arguments are so similar, they have to deliberately appear extremely different. And I think there's a risk that if you do that, it comes across as rather unbelievable. So that's the first thing. Here are a series of questions when you are thinking about whether to run an analysis extension. Some of these are strategic questions. They are basically putting yourself, as I mentioned, in the position of the judge in about 20 to 30 minutes and asking yourself, how will that oral adjudication or that deliberation look like? So these questions are things like, what are the unique selling points of your material? What's special about it? What's different about it, even if there are some overlaps, as we've talked about? The second question is, do you have enough unique selling points that are different from the top half? Because I think sometimes teams do have new things, and it's where a judge says, oh yeah, I definitely caught some of this new stuff. And I don't want to make debating sound like it's this quantity-based method of counting new words, because it isn't. But in a very loose, informal sense, it's a very good proxy for whether your analysis extension is robust enough, right, to actually be an extension. So the point is, even if you are running some very similar arguments, you should have either one or two very major conceptual differences, or even if it's like 5 or 6 small little things that collectively can be credited as something new, right? So this question of do I have enough isn't meant to be answered in nominal terms. You're not supposed to count them up, but you have to kind of make an estimate in your head whether the judge will accept this collection of things as new, right? And it's a tough decision to have to make, but I think it's a difference between judges who then say in your oral adjudication, ultimately we thought there was some new stuff here. So definitely there was an extension, but it wasn't important enough to outweigh the opening. And hearing an oral adjudication that goes something like, in the end we thought closing half ran some similar arguments, but their characterization of the issue or of the situation was so different that we were able to give them credit for that. So these are the things that judges will say, and what you're trying to do in essence is think in advance. If I cobble this stuff together into a product on balance of probability, which one of these outcomes is going to occur? I think even if you do have unique selling points and you have enough unique selling points, the third thing to ask yourself, and this really isn't about picking the extension, but more so how you choose to run it, is, are these selling points memorable? Do they stand out? And this is crucial, most of all, can a judge or a wing summarize what is new about them in a 10-second tidbit collectively? Because, again, like, think about what the worst case scenario for you, right? You're in, like, I don't know, round 2 of Worlds. You get drawn against a bunch of teams who also won their round, and they're all quite decent. But the chair judge, isn't someone who's in the top rooms of Worlds yet. And so you've got a good set of wings, and you run an analysis extension, but this wing who's trying to explain to others what your extension is finds it so difficult that by the end of that 15 minutes, they're just not convinced. And so, you lose the first second or the second third on some sort of a split. I think it's very important to remember that at the end of the day, when it comes to this subjective call about the product you're selling, with the argument you're selling, someone is going to, where it is dubious or in doubt, someone is going to have to defend it in the adjudication for you by saying, here's what's new about it. So I think what you also want to do, in addition to making sure your material has those new things in an analysis extension, is also to make sure those new things stand out, right? And I think one way of doing this is what I've suggested, that you might want to at times say, here's what's common, here's what's new. So here's what's common with our top half, here's what we're going to add. Another way of doing it is to use different language, use different words, to deliberately choose a set of words that is in the same subject area as the top half material, but sounds different. And that's the word, or that's the phrase you keep using again and again. I guess a third potential thing that is sometimes used is what assumptions or processes does your material not depend on, right? So if it depends on a different mechanism, or it doesn't depend on a set of assumptions, then it's different by virtue of what underlies that argument. So bearing this in mind, how should you proceed in practical terms? So I think the first step is, and I'm presuming here you've got some idea of what an extension is, because I think the focus of this workshop is going to be on specifically what you do when you're crafting them or choosing which to run. So let's say you've got a list of points, and an opening takes off a bunch of them, but there's some stuff in there, little snippets of each one that you think can constitute an analysis extension. I think this should be an experience that most semi-experienced debaters are familiar with. I think in practical terms, the first thing you need to do, either as a team or I suppose as an extension speaker, if you're the one who makes the decision, is to, again, in your head, mentally run through the cluster of arguments you have, the cluster of things you have. It doesn't always have to be a cluster. Sometimes it's just one. If you've got one very good analysis addition, then by all means do that. But again, in the worst case scenario, go through the list of things you are going to add to the top half in this similar sounding point of yours. Ask yourself if there is genuinely enough in there. And I think this is a judgment call. It's a judgment call that you get better with the more debates you do. I'm also not going to lie. I think it's a judgment call you get better at making the more experience you have, in the sense of the more skilled you are at running arguments. So, for example, the more experienced you are in running different versions of an argument, the more likely you are to say, oh, actually, I can do something here that's going to be different from what the top half does. Whereas if you're relatively inexperienced and you're used to running certain basic arguments in a fairly basic way, there's nothing wrong with that. It just means that your threshold for whether you can sell this thing might be different. And so I guess it's good to have some awareness of what your own strengths and weaknesses are. So for example, I think I'm not as good at selling particularly or some types of emotional arguments or emotive language, or in certain types of debates. So for example, if there were a debate about a set of European politics, for example, it's not the kind of argument I would feel less confident about how much range I would have to make an argument there, whether I could make a unique selling point. Whereas if it were an argument about Southeast Asia, then obviously I'd feel more confident in adding material in lots of ways to even a very competent top half team. So I think some of this is about knowing your strengths and weaknesses and being honest about those things. So in your mind, you go through the unique selling points, you think to yourself, do I have enough of them? And then if you do think there are enough of them, then this is an extension that you can run. I mean, of course, even if you don't have enough of them, you might not have a choice, right? So sometimes in a debate, you are stuck with nothing to run, in which case you move on to the next step. The next step is to then take those unique selling points and find a way to make them memorable. Yeah, so keep them nice and punchy, use different language, and always make sure that a judge on the panel can summarize or can immediately recall what is new about them. So in practical terms, how might you do this? Well, what I do is I mark out the new bits of my material in a slightly different color, or I put a star beside them. So when I see that star, I'm reminded that this is something I should emphasize as being new, even as I'm running the argument that is already quite similar. But there are many ways you could do this, right? So you could use new words, put in place new concepts, new examples, new illustrations, new mechanisms, and new processes. Okay, so I think if I had to summarize very briefly what we've been through, the point here is twofold. Number one, you should be quite honest and upfront about the fact that your arguments are not going to be wonderfully and wholly new. And second of all, bearing that in mind, you should be quite clear, both in your own mind as well as in your speech, where you are adding those little things, so that a judge can, in the discussion or in their own minds, quite confidently say, yeah, it was the same type of argument, but I can quite clearly see where the additions are. I guess what we could quickly do is give 3 examples of the type of selling and type of thing to focus on. They'll be quite brief, but I'm happy to elaborate on them if people would like at some point in the future. So a debate I recently did was about whether you should hire and promote faculty members in university based on their teaching abilities rather than the research quality. And so what I want you to think about is the opposition team line at this point. So the opposition team line says research is important. And I think opening opposition in the debate I was in did a quite good job explaining why research was very good. And they explained how the research pedigree of the university faculty is very good for the output of research. So I think one way in which you can try and extend in an analysis way about research is to explain something that's particularly unique about the motion. So for example, you might say something like research is particularly good when it's done in universities as opposed to in, say, private think tanks or corporations. And I think the reasons for this might be reasonably intuitive. So it's about saying things like one gets monetized and patented for 20 years, the other one becomes public access, and so on and so forth. So what's doing the work here? What's helping this argument potentially help you take it? What's making this argument potentially superior to that of the opening team? I think it's about implicitly putting in place some sort of a context, right? So what I'm really trying to focus on here is the fact that the research will either be in universities or be in private corporate think tank or think tanks. And I think making that observation, even if the point is about research, a weaker judge might say, well, yeah, they just made an argument about research, but a stronger judge will be able to say, so what they were able to do here was show that there was a new impact or a new type of research, a new context to this research that is in some way important. I guess, and this is a bit of an aside, I should have mentioned this earlier. One thing that is very, very important in this sort of extension, in order to be able to sell it, you kind of need to know what came before. So for example, if you know you're selling like a vacuum cleaner and someone else has been there before you, you've got, or a customer who's already quite comfortable with the product they have. In order to get them to switch products, you need to know what they're switching away from, right? Because that's how you convince them that you've got something superior. And one mistake I see lots of teams make is they spend a lot of their time in the top half thinking either of responses and rebuttal or writing their own extension. And obviously both of these things are very important, but I think teams in closing don't listen enough to the specific details and the specific way an argument is being made. And it's vital, right? Because if, for example, all you do is listen to the headline, opening op says in this debate, we are going to show you why research is important and we get better research. And if I switch off as a speaker and then focus on writing my extension, then I'm going to miss out on the fact that, for example, all the opening opposition's mechanisms are about faculty doing research and why they're very clever, they're very intelligent, and why professors can do research very well, right? So that means when I come to thinking about whether I can run this extension, well, I've got something on research as well, but I'm not 100% confident as to whether it's new enough, whether my mechanism is different. The only way you can ever know that as an extension speaker is to be able to listen for as much as you can to the top half as it's happening. And I think this is one of those cases, in my personal beliefs, that getting good at debating isn't just about one particular set of skills. So for example, this is one of those cases where you would be a better extension speaker if, for example, you were able to debate with fewer notes, right? Because if you need fewer notes to give a speech, then you could write less and spend the extra time listening. And if you listened more, you would presumably make improvements in how you chose or sold your analysis extensions. So a lot of these things have spin-on effects. And I think particularly in the back half of BP debating, where so much is strategic and responsive, then getting better at all these skills might not in themselves seem like huge deals. But in the long run, cumulatively, they will be. Anyway, so that's one example. Here's another example. So I think a lot of people have seen a fairly classic debate about one belt, one road, whether it's good or bad. Imagine on a gov site that says it's good. An opening government says, it's really good because infrastructure will increase trade has many benefits, and these benefits will accrue to the economy. So, big, bold economic point here, and that's how they sell it. If you're in closing and you want to run an argument about the economy, again, that's fine. Here's how you might create a unique selling point to remind the judge that even though the analysis is about economic benefits and economic impacts, i.e. people get richer, usual stuff, there's a significant difference. So, for example, you might say, what's unique about One Belt, One Road is the fact that it doesn't just pay for trade in general. It's not just like any other trade deal. It specifically builds infrastructure. And what's good about infrastructure is that even if it's unused today, which is one of the classic criticisms of the One Belt, One Road policy, knowing that there is unused infrastructure shifts business decisions in 5 to 10 years. And so businesses will want to exploit that. And you might also say, for example, that if it doesn't work out, then China has an incentive to channel trade through those areas, given that it's their infrastructure. At the end of the day, if they seize it back, it's their infrastructure, it's their airports and their ports that are going underused. So not only is there a good potential that's being created, there are also the good incentives for China to increase trade in the region. So I do think this is an analysis extension, even if the benefits are going to be the same, right? The benefits are going to be there is more trade, there is more economic linkage, there is more prosperity, and money is good for people because it allows them to buy things. But despite that, the newness, I think, comes from a focus on the word infrastructure, on the meaning of infrastructure, on showing that One Belt, One Road is unique in some way that the initial argument doesn't catch, right? So what's the upshot of this whole discussion? I think the upshot of this whole discussion is that analysis extensions in particular are tricky to do because teams feel like they are in danger of not being new. I think that the right response to this danger of not being new is not to overclaim or oversell the newness. Rather, I think it is to be as precise as possible about what the newness is, and to be, in many ways, upfront with yourself and the judge that it will not be as new as a team which promises you a big, bold extension, which we'll get to in just a second. That being said, I think in your mind, it's very important that you draw the line, that you know where you diverge from your opening team, and that you are able to explain to a judge conceptually, but also using keywords, using signals, using phrases or illustrations if you can, or strategic language, for example, show the judge what is different about it in a way that's easily memorable, that they don't have to hunt for, that they can highlight on their paper. And preferably if you've got it starred or highlighted on your paper, then you can just do the same thing. Then you want the judge to do the same thing. You want the judge to have that idea and immediately recognize what's new or different about it. Cool. What I'm not going to explicitly focus on is how you try and use that to beat an opening team. I think that the ways of doing this, they exist, and I think they, based on, it's a bit hard to do on, it's a bit easier to do on a case-by-case basis. So, because every analysis extension is going to be ever so slightly different. You might be filling in, you might be relying on a different mechanism. You might be independent from a particular assumption. You might be adding context. You might be adding detail. You might be adding any number or any combination of these things. So I'm not going to go into specifics about how you compare yourself to the top half. I think the way to do this is reasonably straightforward, and it's what most WUDC speakers are taught to do already, to be specific about what the top half has said and to show or to make an argument about why something is unique or different about the latter. And I think the usual methods apply as well. So pointing out that you have a different mechanism, pointing out that you are not reliant on certain assumptions, or pointing out that even within, for example, economics, or even within research, you've got a slightly different impact, which means that your economics impact, your research impact can be a bigger impact than the top half. So I think the bit I really want to focus on is not the last bit of saying, why is my material important? I think the usual methods apply. What I also don't want to focus on is the first bit, which is how do we think of arguments in the first place? What I want to focus on is that in-between stage where you are making a decision, and as an extension speaker, you're crafting that material in a particular way to make it sellable and to make it memorable. Cool. So that pretty much sums up what I have to say about analysis extensions. I am going to now move on to the really new points. If you guys have any questions at this point, just feel free to pop them in the chat, and if I see them, I will do my best to answer them. So on really new points, I think this is the cookie cutter classic case of an extension. It's also the extension that most of us feel most confident in because you'll never get the judge saying it's not new. It's definitely going to be new. It's going to be out of this world. I think the trade-off there that many speakers don't think about initially, but is a cause for losing many debates by running these arguments, is skepticism about whether the point itself is viable. Or even if it is viable, and I think this is the vital question, how much legwork or how much effort do you have to put in or do you have to do in order to build this argument up to a plausible form? Because the reason why, presumably, it wasn't run by a competent opening team. Now, of course, there are going to be some cases where the top half just gets the debate wrong or misses a crucial bit of the info slide and runs the wrong arguments, in which case you're home free. But assuming your opening has done a fairly good job and a fairly thorough job, the reason this point is still on the shelf, as it were, is there must be something wrong with it, right? So it has to have a flaw, it has to have a drawback of some kind. And I think very often speakers are so keen on making sure they're different that they don't ask themselves, in order to run this argument, how much do I have to do to make it plausible? And second of all, even at its best, even if I've buffed it up as much as I can, does it weigh up favorably against other arguments in the debate? So, as I've said, right, these arguments tend to be the ones that have a bit more implausible consequences. They're not quite so obvious, which means that you need to go through a larger set of links to make the judge convinced. And the trade-off you need to always be thinking about is, if I go for this play, if I try and make this new argument, will I be able to basically tie up all the loose ends? Will I be able to put the material in its completed form on the table? So, to varying extents, when I was doing extension speeches, my partner and I would have a phrase that we both understood the meaning of, and that phrase was the home run play. I mean, so for those of you who watch baseball, it's baseball season, highly recommend it. The home run is where you swing as hard as you can and you try to hit the ball out. But because you're swinging as hard as you can, if you mess it up, then you're going to look pretty silly doing it. And I think something analogous applies here. So in every debate, we had a home run play that we knew was extremely new, that most likely an opening team would not take or would not have the time to develop with any real certainty. And we had it as a reserve in case we needed it, right? So for us, that was the argument that had the maximum level of newness, but also the maximum level of legwork or burden if we were trying to run that. And I think the reason it's useful to think in these terms, I mean, we also had other arguments on the spectrum. So we had them going, I suppose, from most obvious to least obvious, something like that. And I think it's very useful to think about this trade-off, the trade-off between originality and shock value and even impact sometimes, and the amount of work you need to do to build that argument up to that stage. And in essence, for us, the home run play was where this trade-off was the highest risk and the highest reward, right? So it was, if we were forced into a situation where we had nothing else to run, then we would run that. But I think my point is more general than that, which is to say you can think of every argument as having a balance between newness and the amount of effort you would need to make that argument. So let's say you think of a bunch of arguments and you don't have an analysis extension available. So what you need to run a new argument. And you think about it and you pick the argument which you think has the best ratio of reward to effort, as it were. How then should you go about building this argument? Well, I think, if you're reasonably experienced at building arguments, then all the usual caveats would apply. So you should have a thesis, you should make the logical links clear, you should try and prove uniqueness, mutual exclusivity, you should have illustrations, you should have examples, stuff like that. In addition to all those things, here are a few things that it might be prudent to think about. The first is to think about the ordering of tiers within the argument. So I think everyone has their own individual preferences, and I don't think it matters that much in the top half when you're making a very obvious argument that the judge and the panel would immediately recognize. When they recognize the argument, they're going to be able to know where it's going, and as a result, they'll be able to fill in the blanks so that as you give the reasons, they'll be able to know roughly where it's going. Although, of course, in an ideal world, you would still be doing that signposting for the judge. But let's say now you've got an argument out of left field. You've got an argument that's quite different. It's an argument that no one's expecting. And even when you give the initial label, it's not always obvious where this point is going to go. So I'll give some examples in just a second. But I think what's useful then is to think about the ordering of the layers within the point. Usually, I'd say it's best to give a fairly unique label, but to focus on making this label as self-explanatory as possible. So what this means is that you want the judge to hear that line and almost immediately get a summary of how it is you're going to win the debate. Now, I think that there are two options after this that you should think about and choose between. One is, I think, a bit more classic, where you start going through the mechanisms, you start explaining something about the real world, and then you reach a certain conclusion. And then after you reach the conclusion, if you've got time, which many speakers obviously forget about, they then say, oh, why is this important? What's the impact of this argument? How does it weigh up? But I think that's a more classic case of building an argument. It's a lot more intuitive, I suspect, to most people. You explain what happens and you tell them why it matters. Sometimes, if you're running something quite different and quite new, it does make some sense to do this in the reverse order. So for example, you say, what I want to prove to you is that a certain thing will occur. And this certain thing is very significant in the debate because it has these ramifications. I'll get to an example in just a second, but I think the reason this is very useful is because it gives the judge that sense of structure. right? So, very often if you're judging, you hear a team say something like, oh, we're going to give you a new argument on structural reasons why X will happen, or we're going to give you a new argument about how this affects the poor. And sure, that's new and you kind of know what to look out for, but it doesn't give you that same sense of foresight or the same sense of, I see where this argument is going, I can put it together. Whereas if you do it in reverse order, then you are doing two things. The first is you're giving the judge a clear sense of where it is you're going. So when you start building the mechanisms later on, you start giving reasons for things, the judge will know where it is you are pushing toward. The second thing I think it does is it reminds you that you have to do the weighing initially and in your extension speaker. So many judges will say something like, oh, I thought it was the weighing of this argument against other arguments was only done in the whip speaker, and if you could, you should push it up. It's also usually given as a reason to give the extension speaker like 1 or 2 speaks less. So if you don't want that to happen, then what you want to do is remind yourself to do that weighing initially. Now, what I find is that it's more common that you run out of time and that you lose focus as you are reaching the end of your argument, right? So this means that if the end of your argument is the stuff about impacts, then it's easy to have that get lost and to not make clear where your argument fits in with the debate as a whole. Whereas if you flip that, there's no risk of this happening. You're beginning the very argument by telling judges where it is you're going to go, what it is you're shooting for. And I think judges as well appreciate the fact that from the get-go, they can see how this argument fits in strategically. So let's do, I suppose, one example where I show you how this method potentially works, and another example that illustrates what I mean by thinking about the legwork. So again, in a recent tournament I've done, the motion was something about regretting the Philippines' pivot to China. So you can think of this as a broader acceptance of Chinese aid and acquiescence to some Chinese geopolitical demands. Opening government, let's say, run some arguments about the economics of the Philippines, why accepting development aid is very good, and some stuff about regional conflict, why this stops conflict in the South China Sea over disputed islands, and so on and so forth. So let's say we are in closing government, and we want to run a really new argument. And what's going to be really new about it is the fact that we're going to focus on the domestic politics of the Philippines, right? This is not an uncommon strategy. So in most debates about Israel or about Pakistan or whatever country it is we are debating on this fine day, there's always an argument in there somewhere about domestic politics. And I think that can be more or less relevant. And in this case, I think it could be more relevant. And so here's how we're going to think about it, right? So one option, if we're going to make this argument about the internal politics of the Philippines, one option is to do it the classic way. So I think the classic way you'd say, oh, my extension is going to be about the internal politics of the Philippines and why it gets more authoritarian. And then you run some of the mechanisms, and only at the end do you run the impact. I think there's another way you can do this, which is to flip this argument and say, look, thus far the debate has been about general arguments about the relations that any developing country in the region would have with China. But we think the most important thing to focus on is the domestic politics of the Philippines, because especially if it becomes authoritarian, then it potentially could affect the lives of millions of people. But more importantly, what I want to prove to you, that's the key word, what I want to prove to you is that this is going to destroy democratic structures in the Philippines. It's going to erode democratic norms. And this is particularly damaging because all trade policies and conflict, geopolitical conflict changes rather quickly. But once these institutions get eroded, once constitutional changes set in, then not only are they very damaging to a particularly important area of life in the Philippines, they're also irreversible, incredibly hard to reverse, and it's likely to prompt bloodshed or conflict or authoritarianism. So the structuralness of it, the long runness of it, is why I should really care about this point. So by setting it up in this way, I've already begun the process of selling at a time when it doesn't look like I'm rushing the argument. I've already begun to signal to the judge that I know exactly where it is I'm going and that why I'm going in that direction. Right? So, and of course, from here you can run some of the other standard stuff. For example, saying that if Duterte is going to pay for economic development on the basis of Chinese money, then it's a lot easier to sell the importance of a strong man or of domestic stability for economic progress, and how that will then justify even more democratic support for his erosion of democratic norms. I think that part is reasonably straightforward. But I also think it's a lot more straightforward, or it fits into place a lot better once I've told you what it is I'm trying to do, once I've signaled to you that that is the way we are going in this debate. So what is the upshot of this? The upshot of this is when you're running a new point, bear in mind that it's quite new, it's quite original, and bear in mind that its chances are the type of argument that will not come intuitively. And so the response to that should be to be as precise as possible, obviously, like with any argument, but also to potentially think about making clear where it is you're going and why it is you're going in that direction before you start making the argument itself. Now, you might find that this is helpful in general, in which case, by all means, please do that. But I think it's something that's particularly useful whenever I'm making an argument that's a bit less obvious. So one final example, I think, that illustrates the difficulty with these arguments and how you should think about them. So if for those of you who remember the round at Mexico Worlds about limiting the amount of time that a museum can display a given piece of art to basically like a short 3-month period, I think that, for example, if you're faced with an opening gov team that runs a lot of the basic arguments pretty well, for example, pointing out that this is going to allow for cycling of art, it's going to allow for more access in the developing world, or just not even the developing world, but other museums more generally. It ensures that art pieces, a lot more art pieces get displayed, and so on and so forth. So let's say all those arguments are taken. Now, one potential home run play, I think, is to argue that the art market changes in a fundamental way. So you might say, well, this is going to be an argument about the art market. And again, I think you might do something like saying, what I'm going to prove to you is that the art market is going to change structurally for the benefit of the actors. And you explain why that's going to be a good thing. And then you explain the mechanisms for that. So you might say, all actors involved, the art buyers, the curators, the artists have an incentive to change the way they think, to change the way they sell their art, to change the way they market themselves. And these are all the fundamental changes that come about. And so the net result of all of that is that you are going to get an art market that looks a lot more like the market for a Hollywood actor, right? So a Hollywood actor isn't signed to a particular director or a particular studio. They have short-term roles and they move between roles. And crucially, if they get more famous and they get better, then they reap the returns of those roles going forward. Well, what do I want to focus on in this example? Well, it's not so much the argument itself, but to just, if you can kind of see where we're going with this, to have a think about the trade-off between having to prove all these things and showing that these impacts are good. It takes a lot of time. And chances are will mean that your extension speech will be very thin on rebuttal. And the trade-off here is that it's very new. It's very significant. It's definitely impactful because it changes the market on such a large scale. And I think what extension speakers with their teammates should be able to do in these cases is to make a trade-off between the newness of the argument and the amount of effort you need to put in to make this argument work. So what I think this again requires is a very careful appraisal of how good your opening team is. It's also another reason why judging more debates gives you a better sense of how much credit that opening team is going to get. Now, of course, even to this day, I'm still surprised sometimes when opening teams get more credit, or is sometimes the case, less credit than I think they deserve. But I do think that knowing well where your opening is at is going to help you make this choice much better, right? It's gonna, in many ways, it's going to tell you when the best thing to do is to go for that crazy Marxist extension, for example, or when the best thing to do is just to add some context, some arguments, or to go for a less controversial new point. But what I really want to lay out is the kinds of questions you should be thinking about when you're choosing from a list or when you're choosing from a set of options in the debate. Cool. One final thing I want to say here, which is you don't always need to go all in to continue the analogy with these types of arguments. So one thing I think that's sometimes quite useful is to have a brand new argument, but also offer to break some ties or to offer your thoughts on the top half debate. So it's basically a hybrid strategy. It's a combination of running something that's completely new and a combination of analysis extensions that, in closer debates gives you an edge over both the diagonal team as well as the team directly in front of you. So for example, one way of doing this might be to say, we in closing government, closing opposition think that what this debate is really about is X. We're going to start by showing you why X will happen, and we're going to show you why that's important. But even if you don't buy that, we're going to then wade into the top half debate and show you why, on balance, the Gov team is the one that's winning, or the Op team is the one that's winning these series of clashes. Right? So the question there, I think, or when that strategy is viable, is threefold. One, your new material is potentially a bit high risk. So it's something that might not in itself satisfy all judges. Right? So for example, let's say you've got a panel of 4, and if you just run that new material, the home run play, the brand new thing, then maybe you convince 2 judges, but you put yourself at risk of coming a 3rd or a 4th for the next 2 judges, right? And if it just so happens that one of those next 2 is the chair or the wing who happens to be the CA who's there to look at the panel, then you're pretty much screwed because there's a high chance everyone will defer to that judge. So it's a high risk play. On the other hand, if you run a hybrid set of arguments, you make it more likely that those 2 judges who aren't immediately convinced might think that, yeah, you deserve a second or even a first on the basis of your other material. And so when it comes to building consensus, you might still be the consensus first or second, even if not for the same reasons during the deliberation. So I hope that makes sense. I do think this is quite crucial. So number one, hybrid strategy works well when your newest material is potentially a bit risky. I think the second thing to think about is whether the new material can be explained relatively quickly. So if you remember, I was saying that there's a trade-off here, the trade-off between newness and the trade-off with legwork, or the amount of effort you have to put in. Now, obviously, if the amount of effort you have to put in to make your new material stick is quite high, then the hybrid strategy isn't feasible because you don't have enough time to do all of these things, right? You don't have enough time to do rebuttal as well as run the new point as well as try and break some of the deadlocks in the top half. So it could be, it really depends on the type of argument you have in front of you. In some cases, you've got this new argument, but it's also quite easy to make. Right? It's quite obvious. It's just new because it's crazy and it's been out there. In which case, it's a good fit because you can quickly make that argument, impact it, and then move on to the other stuff. But on the other hand, if it's something like what I talked about earlier, so something like changing the art market, or changing geopolitics, changing a particular region, then this is actually a bad strategy because you might end up in a case where your new stuff doesn't get enough time spent to make it stick, and your other stuff ends up sounding too similar, right? So you end up having the worst of both worlds, and I think that's something as well to think about. So yeah, I think this hybrid strategy is about minimizing risk, and I think that's the third thing I want to talk about, which is just sometimes you don't always know with certainty what the panel is going to go for. Now, obviously, the best thing you can do in most cases is to go for the strategy which has the highest expected return, right? But sometimes, once in a while, it does make sense to hedge your bets a little bit and have a collection of points, each of which potentially could win the debate. And as a result, your whip speaker then has a lot more leverage and a lot more leeway to try and make some of these arguments stick. And as I said, it's not the worst thing in the world if 4 judges on a panel think you've won the debate, but for 4 separate reasons or for 4 separate arguments. I mean, it's not ideal, but it's still going to get you 3 points and a first. So, that is good. So again, as you've noticed, a lot of this discussion in all these different versions of it fundamentally still come down to the same thing. It comes down to how you think that panel will buy what it is you're saying, what it is they're looking for, whether they will be able to put aside their doubts and to be convinced that you're ahead of the other team. And I think that's the judgment call you have to make. And the best way to make that judgment call is to have judged enough debates. Although, of course, the way you run your arguments will also maximize the chances you have of succeeding. Cool. I have one last thing to say here, which I think crosses the boundary between both of these arguments, straddles the middle, and I just want to quickly point it out. So sometimes I don't think it's all that often, but in some usually quite long motions, there will be a burden that's quite unique to one team. And if the opening doesn't answer the burden particularly well, then you can build an extension just on the basis of answering that burden. And the reason I say it fits in the middle is because it's not exactly a new argument. It will sound new at times, but it will, chances are, flow within the broader framework of the case that the top half is arguing. I guess I like to think of these as strategic extensions. So what's missing is a very strategic bit of analysis to complete the case. And if you can offer it, then that's obviously a very good selling point. It's also new, and in many ways, it's the best of all worlds. I'll just give a fairly quick example, I think. So for those of you who recall or have seen it, the Euro semi from a year ago was about violent female goddesses as a symbol, a Hindu symbol to be used in India for the feminist movement. And if I recall, in the debate I was in, the question that the top half, or the opening opposition in particular, kept asking is why violent symbols had to be used. So I think the top half debate was good on other things like, why the feminist movement needed a symbol, why this would be effective, and why this would be familiar culturally, why this would be a very good symbol potentially in rallying women, but also men, and why it would be seen as non-Western, right? So in many ways, it did a good job answering why these had to be Hindu female goddesses. But because of the way the debate was panning out, there was a strategic value in being able to answer why violent symbols were important. And I think the way different teams did that in different rounds is online, and you can see that. But it's an example, I think, of where in a fairly long motion with a large series of burdens to prove, being able to highlight a burden of proof that hasn't been satisfactorily dealt with and focusing your attention on it can both be newness, but also an analysis extension. So it's just something to think about. A similar version of this might be in some debates, this house would X all things, right? So sometimes teams make arguments about the general things, they don't answer why it has to be all, so on and so forth. So it's a lot more motion dependent, but if you do think there is a burden that's missing, then you can quite easily slip in there and say, well, here's the burden that's missing, and we're going to answer that burden. Okay, quick summary before we move on to the final bits, which is, so how exactly does one go about selling an extension? I think the summary here is just to say, we've talked about analysis extensions, we've talked about new points, and we've talked about this sort of in-between middle ground of answering a burden. In all of them, the broad challenge is the same, which is to convince a judge that you are new and significant. But because the type of product you're selling, I guess, is slightly different, the challenges along the way are slightly different as well. And we've hopefully chatted a bit about the kind of things you should be thinking about as an extension speaker or as a whip speaker in a team, and some ways in which you can augment the way you run the argument. Okay, so here's the summary, and I guess it's the TLDR. So if you want to skip ahead, this is the time, I suppose. Skip to this point. So how exactly do you sell an extension? The first thing you need to know is you need to know what type it is, right? You need to know at its core what kind of product it is you're selling. It would also be good if you had an honest appraisal of its strengths and weaknesses. You had an honest appraisal of what is new and what is not so new. The second thing is to note that, unlike the analogy, the anecdote I started with about selling a pen to someone, you are in control of the product you are selling. So the way in which you describe this product, the way in which you build it, the way in which you argue it, is going to affect how sellable it is. You are in control of that, right? You get a choice of what product you want to sell, but also you get a choice of how you're going to package it, how you're going to put it together, right? And I think, given that there are so many ways of framing arguments, of running arguments, of building arguments, of structuring arguments, all those general debate skills factor in an indirect way. So that is to say, you should, based on the kind of material, on the kind of extension you're running, you should think about how best to put those tools together, to put those things together. But in general, I'd say you should be extremely thorough about what is new. So either the new burden that you're trying to prove, the new impact, the new mechanisms, the new links, be as explicit as possible. But as I've said, don't overclaim. Don't exaggerate, because that diminishes your credibility. You should be as upfront and honest about it as possible, and I think judges will appreciate that. Use new words that become stickers or taglines or headlines. These new words shouldn't be substitutes for analysis. So you shouldn't use a word like structural or like incentives or comparative or whatever it is. You shouldn't use these words as replacements for analysis. What you should use them as are, I guess, like the things which you want the judge to remember. Right? And I can't stress this enough. At the end of the debate, there are going to be 15 minutes in an in-round for judges to very quickly convince themselves and convince others that there was new material there. And you want to make it as easy as possible for them to find that material and to be confident that it is indeed new. Okay, and I think this is one of those things as well that these trigger words should be repeated, not just, sorry, they should be used not just in the extension speech so that the judge has one set of words on his or her paper, or their paper, but where possible to get the whip speaker to do the same thing as well. So collectively as a team, it becomes a lot more consistent what it is you are selling. Third of all, you should be able to describe as well as possible the debate and what state it is in. So this is, I think, an extremely underrated skill. Many teams don't do this. So for example, many teams will say things like, there is a deadlock in the top half, or they might say things like, proposition didn't give you structural reasons. Here are 3 structural reasons. And I think that's obviously useful, but it helps to be able to describe that with even more specificity. So for example, the top half debate focused on the direct research output of individual professors. We are going to focus on the types of research that only universities can provide by virtue of being public institutions. So being the more, I guess you can think of it as like a graphics card, right? Or like a very pixelated image versus a very sharp and clear image. If you're capable of depicting the sharp and clear image, it leaves you more space, as it were, or leaves you, it makes the judge more confident that you're either adding something new because the judge is very clear exactly what the contribution was in the top half, as opposed to a fuzzy and blurry image that's very pixelated. If this is what the top half has built, then the more blurry it is, the less confident the judge is that you're actually outside that set, that block of stuff. So being able to describe the debate, being able to describe the back and forth, being able to describe the specific responses, being able to describe the specific moves that are made by all teams. Extremely underrated, but very important in showing the judge that you're falling on the right side of the line, as it were. In fact, sometimes you can very cleverly describe the debate in a certain way, which I guess is fair, but not necessarily accurate, in order to make your extension seem more relevant. So again, I think this is a skill which is a general debate skill. It's also useful in rebuttal, for example, but it's a skill that also has a constructive value here as well, right? So in rebuttal, it's quite obvious that in order to rebut an argument, you need to be able to describe what it is you are rebutting. But that same skill, which you can develop by practicing your rebuttal, by judging more, it's also very useful in judging, right? So for example, in an oral adjudication, judges will say things like, so the top half debate was about X, these were the issues, these were the moves that were made, closing government responded by saying this, closing opposition came in with this argument beat that. Like, this skill is useful in any number of things, but one way in which it is extremely useful is in being able to explain to the judge where your additions are, by being extremely precise about what has come before you. Cool. So, and the fourth thing is, I've got 5 things, so we're almost there. The fourth thing is, and I've suggested this again and again, I'm going to repeat it again, putting some of my advice to good use, I suppose, is to put yourself in that deliberation, to put yourself in that discussion about what it is you are selling. The easier it is for the panelists and the chairs to convince each other that you've won, the easier it is for them to cite evidence that you've said these things that is truly new, that is truly impactful, that is explicit about weighing, for example, then the more likely it is you will win. The more likely it is they will buy what you have to say. Think about all the times you've judged personally a shaky closing team. Make a list of the mistakes that they make, or make a list of the justifications that judges, chairs, and wings have used to dismiss them, and using that list, try and make sure that you never fall prey to those mistakes, especially where they're easily avoidable. Yeah. So I really can't stress this enough. Given how subjective extensions are, given the fact that newness and relevance is so subjective compared to perhaps other areas of debate. I mean, yeah, we can have a discussion on that. But my point is, at the end of the day, it's going to be something that a team, it's going to be something that a judge is going to have to prefer on some level. And given that, what you should do is put yourself in their shoes and ask, how do they generally go about deciding these things? And yeah, so cool. Last of all, I think that the fifth thing to have as an ingredient to sell an extension is confidence. Now, I perhaps think that this is part of the reason why people really dislike the idea of extensions that get away with not saying very much new. But up until the point where debate judging becomes an incredibly precise forensic activity, the way in which a speaker presents their arguments is going to matter. So very often, looking back on an extension, especially of the wild and crazy kinds that I suppose on reflection don't seem as correct as they did at the time, I usually come to realize it isn't very persuasive. But if you think about it, your arguments just need to last about 30 minutes in the minds of mankind, right? So you give your extension, the back half debate goes on for another like 20 minutes maybe, and for the next 10 minutes, you need judges to be somewhat persuaded of it. And once the ballot's off, that's it. You've got the result, right? And I know it's a bit disingenuous to say that, but I do think it is a feature, not a bug, of the British parliamentary format, which is to say that the reason it's so exciting and the reason being in back half is so unique compared to other formats is that sense of newness, a sense of freshness. But conversely, that sense of risk, sense of expression, the risk of taking chances. And I think whenever you're taking a chance, or whenever you're running something that you're not super confident in, it's extremely important to pretend or to demonstrate a high level of confidence. You need to be able to believe in this argument in order to convince a judge that it's not just there because you're obeying the rules, but that you genuinely are making a contribution to the debate. Again, it's like a fairly generic debate skill, I think, in the sense that confidence is always useful. But I would say that confidence or lack of confidence in the extension is doubly vital. It's doubly vital because, again, given the fact that judges are already scrutinizing it for newness, for clarity, for impact, for mechanisms, it's important not to give them any easy outs. It's important not to give them any easy excuses to say that your extension either wasn't clear enough or wasn't contextualized enough, wasn't characterized enough. And I think these are just some of the results of not having perhaps that high level of confidence. So I think that the way to go is to be confident, to be bold, to not overcompensate, and to, I guess, to know your stuff and to do as good a job you can of selling it to the audience. All right, that pretty much wraps it up. I think it's been an hour. I'm just going to, I suppose, briefly summarize everything that we've chatted about so far. The overarching theme is just to think like a judge. Think about what's going to happen in that room, what's going to happen in that panel, based on the judges that you get in your circuit, or I guess at Worlds, based on the average reasonable member of the judge pool. If you think like that, it will be a very good heuristic to tweak the way you are building an extension. So, because I'd imagine different speakers have different strengths and different weaknesses. Part of getting feedback from a judge is thinking about that. When it comes to picking your extension, I think knowing broadly what types there are crucial. But as I've suggested, the trade-off for an analysis extension and the trade-off for the really new points are slightly different. But knowing well what those trade-offs are will give you a better sense of how strongly you should commit to any of those things. Or in some cases, as I've suggested, you might not need to commit to one strategy at all and find some way to run a hybrid of both. Last of all, when it comes to running the argument, I think that there are important things you can do to make the newness of your material seem more persuasive and seem more self-evident. That could be either in the form of the words you choose or the way you structure how you go about building the argument in the first place. And I think it would be slightly different for each type of argument, and that's something that you as an individual speaker need to figure out for yourself. Cool. So I hope this has been useful. I do think that it's tough and it's not easy, but it's also extremely fun because when you figure it out, it's something that keeps debates fresh, and you always go into the debate not knowing what's going to happen. And I think that the adrenaline of being able to pull it off is one of the best feelings in debating that there is. So best of luck, and I hope this has been useful. If you've got any questions, feel free to message me personally or to leave them as comments, and I'll do my best to answer them. Thank you very much, and wherever you are at, good night / good evening.